The air in the Scriptoria Antiqua, deep within the venerable University of Rome, hung heavy with the scent of aged paper and forgotten ink. Dr. Aris Thorne, his silver-streaked hair a testament to decades spent hunched over crumbling manuscripts, traced a finger along a faded Latin inscription. "Utter nonsense," he muttered, adjusting his spectacles. "A common enough sentiment among the Goths. Lamenting their fate rather than accepting their martial prowess was simply superior." He was studying a 5th century chronicle, a particularly verbose account of Alaric's sack, filled with the usual laments and self-aggrandizing prophecies of doom. Aris believed the fall of Rome was a complex tapestry woven from economic decay, political instability, and barbarian pressures, a straightforward, albeit tragic, historical event. Mysticism and divine curses belonged in fantasy novels, not academic discourse. The silence, broken only by the rhythmic tick of an antique grandfather clock, was abruptly shattered. The heavy oak door creaked open, admitting a shaft of bright Roman sunlight and the whirlwind presence of Elara Vance. Her face was flushed, her usually neat auburn ponytail slightly askew, and her eyes, bright with an almost feverish excitement, sparkled behind her glasses. In her arms she clutched a leather-bound folio, its cover brittle with age. "Aris, you won't believe what I found," she exclaimed, a breathless note in her voice. She navigated the labyrinthine shelves of scrolls and books with practiced ease, placing the folio reverently onto the large central study table. Aris sighed, a long-suffering sound. "Elara, if this is another of your theories about forgotten underground aqueducts or undiscovered Mithraic temples beneath the Vatican, I assure you my patience for ancient mysteries is wafer-thin this morning." Elara, undeterred, gently opened the folio. Its vellum pages were filled with elegant, if archaic script, and intricate, almost psychedelic illuminations that pulsed with greens and golds. "It's not an aqueduct, Aris. It's a diary or a codex from a lesser-known Vestal, Aelia, written in the late 4th century, and she speaks of something far more profound than barbarians or corrupt emperors." Aris leaned closer, a flicker of professional curiosity piercing his scholarly composure. "A Vestal's diary. Interesting. Most records from the Vestals were meticulously destroyed or lost. What does she describe? The political intrigues of Honorius, the changing religious landscape?" Aris shook her head, her fingers hovering over a particularly complex diagram that resembled a stylized heart within a city outline. "She speaks of Rome's soul, not allegorically, Aris. She describes it as a living entity, an unseen current that flowed through the fairy stones of the city, through the minds of its people. She calls it the Anima Urbis, the soul of the city, the very essence of Roman ingenuity and will." Aris scoffed. "A politic fancy, Elara. The Romans were prone to personifying their concepts. Virtus, pietas, equitas. These were ideals, not literal beings. But she doesn't treat them as an ideal," Elara insisted, tapping a paragraph. "She writes of its ebb and flow, correlating its strength with Rome's golden ages, and its weakening with the decline. She speaks of priests, forgotten by our histories, who tended to this anima, maintaining its vitality. And then Aris, she describes its final, heartbreaking dimming, a slow draining that left the Romans hollow, devoid of their spark, long before the Goths ever breached the Aurelian walls. She says, when the anima whispered its last, the empire had already fallen, though its body still stood proud." Aris peered at the diagram, his brow furrowed. The intricacy was unusual for a simple allegorical illustration. He read a few lines, his Latin fluent and precise. The words were indeed haunting, detailing a loss not of territory or wealth, but of an inherent force. A cold shiver, utterly uncharacteristic for the pragmatic historian, ran down his spine. Aelia suggests a spiritual collapse. "More than spiritual," Elara corrected, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "She describes symptoms, apathy, a lack of innovation, sudden bursts of illogical fury, a pervasive sense of listlessness that settled over the populace. Not lead poisoning, not economic woes, but an existential fatigue, an inability to be Roman, because the very essence of what made them so had departed. Aris, what if the real reason the Roman Empire fell isn't something we can read in history books, but something we literally can't see?" She looked at him, her gaze imploring. "What if Aelia was telling us the unvarnished truth?" The grandfather clock ticked, its sound suddenly deafening in the sudden silence. Aris looked from the ancient text to Elara's earnest face, and then back to the peculiar diagram. The concept was absurd, yet the raw conviction in Aelia's words, filtered through centuries, stirred something dormant within him. He usually scoffed at such fanciful notions, but Elara's intensity was infectious, and the meticulous detail in the codex was undeniably intriguing. This wasn't merely a myth, it felt like a warning. For the first time, Dr. Aris Thorne felt a genuine crack in the bedrock of his understanding of history.
Traced a finger along a faded Latin inscription, his brow furrowed in concentration. The parchment, brittle with age, crackled softly under his touch, a whisper from antiquity. This wasn't one of the grand public decrees or philosophical treatises he usually spent his days poring over. This was a personal journal entry, tucked away in the back of a forgotten compilation of minor senatorial reports, barely legible, its ink having faded to a ghostly brown. He'd stumbled upon it quite by accident, searching for a reference to a little-known tax reform, and now it held him captive. Quando lux animae obscurata est, custodes recesserunt, Roma in pulveren versa est, he murmured, translating aloud, his voice raspy. When the light of the soul was obscured, the guardians withdrew. Rome turned to dust. He leaned back, his chair groaning in protest, the cryptic words echoing in the hushed chamber. The light of the soul? Guardians? This isn't a barbarian invasion, nor economic collapse, nor political strife. His mind, a vast library of classical knowledge, churned. He had read countless accounts, analyzed economic models, debated social theories. Never once had he encountered such abstract, almost poetic reasoning for Rome's demise in an otherwise mundane historical document. It felt personal, profoundly so, a lament, not a historical record. A soft knock interrupted his reverie. "Dr. Thorne, are you in there?" A younger, clearer voice, carrying a faint accent he couldn't quite place, pierced the ancient quiet. "Yes, Dr. Petrova, come in," Aris replied, slightly flustered, gently covering the brittle parchment with a protective sheet. Dr. Lena Petrova, a woman perhaps in her late 20s, with bright, inquisitive eyes and a cascade of dark, curly hair, stepped into the scriptoria. She carried a sleek tablet, a stark contrast to the dust-laden tomes surrounding her. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, Doctor. Professor Antonelli said you might have some insight into the symbology of the Vestal Virgin seals for my digital reconstruction project." Her gaze, however, was drawn not to him, but to the half-covered manuscript on his desk. She noticed the slight tremor in his hand as he adjusted the protective sheet. "No, not at all, Dr. Petrova," Aris said, clearing his throat. "Please, come in. The Vestals, yes, fascinating, but I've just come across something quite remarkable and utterly perplexing." He hesitated, then, driven by a scholar's instinct to share a profound discovery, pulled back the sheet. "Read this, if you would. My Latin is rusty on some of these older idiomatic phrases." Lena leaned closer, her tablet resting on a stack of books. Her eyes scanned the faded script, then widened slightly. She reread the passage, her lips moving silently. "Quando lux animae obscurata est, custodes recesserunt." This phrasing is extremely unusual for this period, Dr. Thorne. It's almost esoteric. It sounds like a lament, yes, but also like a highly metaphorical explanation, possibly even a coded one for something profoundly spiritual or ideological. "Precisely," Aris exclaimed, relief washing over him that someone else grasped the peculiarity. "But what does it mean? The light of the soul? Are we talking about national morale? A collective will? And guardians, not legions, surely, not the praetorians." Lena tapped her chin thoughtfully. Given the context of this journal, a minor senatorial report, it's unlikely to be purely philosophical musing without some grounding. What if lux animae refers to the very essence of Roman identity, the collective belief, the shared purpose that bound the empire together? And guardians, perhaps not physical protectors, but the custodians of that essence, those who maintained its spiritual and cultural integrity. She looked up, her eyes bright with sudden insight. What if the Roman Empire didn't fall because of external pressures or internal strife alone, but because it lost its animating spirit, and those who knew how to rekindle it simply withdrew? Aris stared at her, a chill creeping down his spine. Withdrew? You mean they left? Or simply faded into obscurity? The implications were staggering. A deliberate, unseen departure of the very soul of Rome. If that were true, Dr. Petrova, every history book would need to be rewritten. He picked up the fragile parchment again, his fingers trembling slightly. "We have to find out more about these custodes and this light of the soul. This isn't just history, Lena. This is a secret."
Traced a finger along a faded Latin inscription, his brow furrowed in concentration. The parchment, brittle with age, crackled softly under his touch, a whisper from antiquity. This wasn't one of the grand public decrees or philosophical treatises he usually spent his days poring over. Instead, it was the intimate, unsettling personal journal of Lucius Verus, a 4th century imperial census bureau administrator. Aris adjusted his spectacles, bringing the faint script into sharper focus. Lucius Verus, a name utterly absent from historical records, poured his thoughts onto these fragile leaves. Initial entries were mundane: census figures, grain allocations, bureaucratic complaints. Typical, Aris thought, until his eye caught a peculiar phrase repeated with increasing frequency: the quiet emptying. He leaned closer, dust motes dancing in sunlight. Lucius described a phenomenon defying logical explanation, not plague, war, or famine, but a gradual, imperceptible decline in the spirit of the populace. People weren't dying, they simply faded. Their ambition, civic duty, their will to connect seemed to slowly leach away. Lucius wrote of neighbors becoming strangers, vibrant public spaces growing eerily silent, grand projects abandoned, not for lack of funds, but for lack of collective will. The forum itself, Aris murmured, translating a particularly striking passage, becomes a stage without actors, its grand pronouncements echoing only in the ears of the wind. We count fewer births, yes, but also fewer marriages, fewer friendships forged, fewer disputes worth settling. The very fabric unravels, not torn by barbarian blades, but by threads simply ceasing to exist. This was radical. Mainstream history cited economic collapse, barbarian incursions, political instability, religious shifts, yet various painted a picture of a society quietly hollowing itself out from within. A psychological plague? A spiritual malady? Aris found traditional explanations incomplete, too focused on external pressures. But this, an internal erosion, a collective loss of purpose and identity preceding external collapse. He read on, his heart thumping with excitement and unease. Lucius's entries grew desperate, his observations acute. Officials attempted to reignite civic pride, to mobilize the populace, only to be met with apathy, a shrug of resignation. The people weren't rebellious, they were simply indifferent, a silence more terrifying than uproar. The final entry Aris could decipher spoke of deep despair. We are not conquered by iron, but by the quiet absence of our own fire. The empire does not fall, it merely forgets how to be. Aris sat back, parchment rustling. Decades of research, thousands of documents, never such a perspective. It wasn't about barbarians at the gates, it was about the emptiness within. Romans hadn't lost the will to fight, they had lost the will to care. He looked around the silent scriptorium, feeling a chill unrelated to the ancient stones. This wasn't merely a footnote, it was a fundamental reinterpretation of history's greatest mystery. He needed to find more, verify this, understand the mechanism of this quiet emptying. He knew with certainty he couldn't do it alone.
This wasn't one of the grand public decrees or philosophical treatises he usually spent his days poring over. It was a fragment, barely a palm's width, from what appeared to be a personal ledger, or perhaps a series of mundane notes kept by a minor official, far from the thundering halls of power in Rome. His eyes, keen despite his age, traced the delicate script, noting the almost hurried formation of some letters, the faded urgency of others. This was a private record, meant only for the author's eyes, scribbled in a hand that suggested a mind preoccupied, perhaps even distressed. He leaned closer, adjusting the ancient, heavy spectacles perched on his nose. The inscription, written in a slightly erratic, almost shorthand Latin, revealed not imperial edicts or grand historical events, but a series of unsettling observations. Dates followed by terse, often cryptic remarks. Ides March 451 AD. The birds have stopped their dawn chorus. Calends of April 451 AD. The taste of the grapes is diminished. A flatness pervades the harvest. Nuns of May 451 AD. The laughter of children seems thinner, less joyful, like a fading echo. A shiver, unrelated to the drafty room, prickled Dr. Thorne's skin. He had encountered countless records of famine, plague, and war in his career, but never before had he seen such an insidious, almost poetic record of decline. It spoke not of conquest or economic collapse, but of a quiet fading, a loss of something fundamental, vitality, joy, the very essence of life itself, slowly draining from the world. This wasn't a sudden cataclysm, but a creeping desiccation. A soft, insistent rap on the heavy oak door broke his trance. "Dr. Thorne, are you in there? It's Liam. I have those cross-referenced Punic War texts you asked for." The voice, young and eager, belonged to Liam O'Connell, Aris's brightest, if sometimes overly enthusiastic, doctoral student. Liam was a whirlwind of fresh ideas and modern methodologies, a stark contrast to Aris's more traditional approach, yet their shared passion for ancient history created an unspoken bond that transcended their generational differences. "Come in, Liam," Aris called, carefully placing a weighted leather strap across the precious parchment fragment, as if protecting it from unseen forces. Liam entered, a stack of weighty tomes balanced precariously in his arms. his bright eyes, usually darting around with restless energy, immediately fixated on the small, unassuming parchment beneath Aris's hand. "What's that, Dr. Thorne?" Liam asked, setting the books down with a soft thud that echoed in the quiet room. "Looks like another one of your deep dives into the utterly obscure. Is it a tax receipt from a forgotten provincial governor or a laundry list from a Vestal virgin?" He grinned, a familiar jest between them, designed to lighten the intense academic atmosphere. Aris allowed a faint smile to touch his lips, though his gaze remained fixed on the ancient script. Neither, Liam. And yet this fragment, it might be more significant than any imperial decree I've ever translated. Sit down. I want you to look at this. Tell me what you make of it. His voice had a rare tremor of urgency, a quality that instantly erased Liam's jovial demeanor. Liam sensed the shift, his own youthful curiosity sharpening into genuine intrigue. He pulled up a worn wooden chair, its legs scraping softly against the flagstones, his gaze now mirroring Harris's intense focus as he leaned in to examine the cryptic lines that whispered from a distant, fading past.
Dr. Aris Thorne leaned closer, his breath misting faintly on the ancient vellum. The light from his desk lamp, a modern concession in the otherwise stubbornly archaic Scriptoria Antiqua, cast dancing shadows across the Latin script. His initial assumption that this was a mere administrative fragment, an inconsequential snippet of daily Roman life, was beginning to unravel. The delicate tremor in his fingertips wasn't just from the parchment's fragility, it was the nascent thrum of intellectual alarm. He painstakingly traced a series of symbols, a peculiar shorthand he hadn't encountered in his extensive studies of Roman bureaucratic notation. It wasn't formal cursive, it wasn't the abbreviated forms of legal documents. It was almost a code. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to decode individual entries, comparing them against known regional dialects and minor official lexicons he'd catalogued over the years. His silver-streaked hair, usually neatly swept back, now fell in wisps across his forehead as he immersed himself in the forgotten language of a bygone clerk. Frumentum distributum, regio vi, mensura 340, ciclus renovatus 1.0, servitorium assignatus I, praetura urbi, die exdecimal calens septemter, he murmured aloud, translating as he went. Grain distributed, Region 7, Measure 340, Replenishment Cycle 1.0, Servitors assigned 2, Urban Praetor's Office, 18th day before the calends of September. He repeated the crucial phrase, Replenishment Cycle 1.0, and Servitors assigned 2. His brow furrowed deeper, a chasm of consternation edged into his face. 1.0. Perfect efficiency, no wastage, no delay, no recorded human interaction in the distribution chain beyond the abstract servitors, not service, not mancipium, not famulus, servitorium, a term I've only ever seen in highly specialized engineering texts from a much later period, referring to automated mechanisms, never applied to a live being, nor in an administrative ledger concerning mundane city grain distribution in the late Empire. The implications were startling, a cognitive dissonance that made his spine tingle. Grain distribution in Rome was a logistical nightmare of human hands, carts, haggling, and inevitable inefficiencies. A replenishment cycle 1.0 suggested absolute precision, a mechanical clockwork operation that simply didn't exist in the 3rd or 4th century CE. And servitors? The word itself felt anachronistic, like finding a microchip diagram in a scroll from the Library of Alexandria. Just then, a soft knock resonated on the heavy oak door, causing Dr. Thorne to startle, the parchment almost slipping from his grasp. A young woman, perhaps in her late 20s, poked her head around the doorframe. Her intelligent eyes, framed by dark swept-back hair, immediately fell upon Dr. Thorne's agitated expression. This was Elara Vance, his most promising doctoral student, whose sharp intellect often served as a vital counterpoint to his own esoteric musings. "Dr. Thorne, everything all right? I heard you talking to yourself," Elara said, a faint smile playing on her lips, though her gaze was already assessing the unusual parchment fragment clutched in his hand. He gestured wildly with his free hand towards the table, his usual calm replaced by a frantic energy. "Elara, come in, come in. You won't believe what I found, or rather, what I think I found. This little scrap, this mundane ledger, it's anything but. It's either a colossal hoax, centuries ahead of its time, or it describes something that fundamentally rewrites our understanding of Roman societal infrastructure." Elara, sensing the gravity in his tone, abandoned her usual polite distance and moved swiftly to his side. She leaned over the table, her eyes scanning the faint Latin script. "What is it, doctor?" Pointed with a trembling finger, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper.
frumentum distributum ciclus renovatus 1.0 servitorium assignatus e. Do you see it, Elara? Do you understand what this must mean? Elara's brow furrowed in turn as she deciphered the passage. Her initial expression of curiosity slowly morphed into one of profound bewilderment, then dawning disbelief. The efficient, precise numbers, the peculiar term, the context of Roman antiquity, the pieces, individually innocuous, clicked together to form an image that defied all conventional historical understanding. A chilling possibility began to unfurl in the quiet scriptorium, threatening to rewrite the very narrative of Rome's decline.
Administrative detail? A mere footnote to the grand narrative of Rome. But as his eyes drifted across the meticulously inscribed copperplate, a recurring pattern began to emerge, subtle yet jarringly out of place. This wasn't a record of grain disbursements or tax receipts. It was a series of small, almost absurdly specific entries, peppered throughout the mundane tally of a minor official's daily responsibilities. Ad curam lapidum viae principalis, ut omnes ad lumen solis idem nitorem praebeant, he murmured, translating aloud. For the care of the stones of the main road, that all might present the same sheen in the sunlight. Another entry, a few lines down. Pecunia pro repositione foliorum in horto publico, secundum ordinem pulchritundinis. Funds for the repositioning of leaves in the public garden, according to an order of beauty. And yet another, more startling, stipendium trium scriptorum a recensendum verborum publicorum, ut nulla dissonantia in pronunciatione audiator. Stipend for 3 scribes to review public pronouncements, so that no dissonance in pronunciation might be heard. Dr. Thorne leaned back, a low whistle escaping his lips. His initial dismissive assumption evaporated like morning mist. This wasn't typical administrative oversight. This was a fanatical devotion to an aesthetic, a superficial order that transcended practicality. These weren't grand edicts, but the granular daily minutiae of an official's life, reflecting an institutionalized obsession with conformity and outward perfection. The entries spoke of an almost pathological need for things to appear flawless, regardless of their actual utility or deeper meaning. He reached for the intercom on his desk, a rare modern intrusion into the hallowed silence. Lena, are you free? I think you'll want to see this. Within minutes, Dr. Lena Petrova, a brilliant young paleographer whose sharp intellect was often masked by an unassuming demeanor, stood beside him. Her short, practical haircut framed a face that was usually serene, but now held a flicker of curiosity. She peered over her shoulder at the fragment. What have you found, Aris? Another lost love letter from Hadrian? She quipped, her voice a soft counterpoint to the rustling parchment. Better, Aris chuckled, though his eyes remained serious. Or worse, depending on your perspective. Tell me what you make of these. He pointed to the specific entries. Lena's brow furrowed, mirroring his earlier concentration. She read the translations Aris had scrawled on a nearby notepad, then re-examined the original Latin. Repositioning of leaves for beauty, ensuring same sheen on roadstones. Reviewing pronouncements for pronunciation harmony. What is this, a decree from a particularly fussy emperor's personal gardener? She tried to joke, but the strange nature of the entries was already seeping into her expression. It seems remarkably petty and meticulous for such minor things. Precisely, Aris said, tapping a finger on the vellum. But notice the repetition, not just once, but throughout the fragment. And remember, this is a minor official's ledger. If such trifling, aesthetically driven tasks were a part of his daily routine, what does that imply for the wider bureaucracy, for the entire empire? Lena's eyes widened as the implication dawned on her. You think this wasn't just an isolated incident of an overly zealous civil servant? You think this was systemic? She traced one of the entries with a gloved finger. A mandated, empire-wide obsession with superficial perfection, diverting resources, time, and intellectual capital into polishing cobblestones and perfectly arranging garden foliage, while the barbarian hordes were knocking on the gates? Aris nodded slowly, a profound sense of awe and disquiet settling over him. The Roman Empire didn't fall because of lead poisoning, or barbarian invasions, or even economic collapse in the way we typically imagine. Perhaps, Lena, it suffocated under the sheer weight of its own obsessive pursuit of outward, sterile perfection, to the detriment of any real substantive action. He looked up, meeting Lena's gaze. This isn't just a fragment of a ledger. This, I suspect, is a microscopic window into the bureaucratic, cultural, and even psychological decay that consumed an empire, unnoticed because it was disguised as order, as beauty, as the very essence of Romanitas. A chill permeated the air, colder than the scriptoria's usual draft. The real reason, he realized, was staring back at them, etched in the mundane, forgotten lines of a dead man's notes. It was a series of meticulously dated observations, almost clinical in their precision, describing a peculiar biological phenomenon. Dr. Thorne squints, adjusting the angle of the lamp, convinced his eyes were playing tricks. The entries, spanning several decades, started innocuously enough, often appended to the daily tally of supplies or minor repairs. The first mention, dating from the late 3rd century, spoke of a luminous moss discovered deep within an old, disused cistern beneath the official's villa, noting its eerie, pallid blue glow that provided a faint, natural illumination in the otherwise Stygian darkness. A curiosity, perhaps even a minor aesthetic marvel. Subsequent entries, however, began to track its spread. It wasn't aggressive, not a rampant vine or a suffocating mold. Rather, it was insidious, creeping slowly along damp stones, through cracks in the foundations of public baths, then along the dark hidden channels of the aqueducts. The official, whose name was faintly inscribed as Lucius Claudius, meticulously recorded its appearance in different sectors of the city, often noting how it shimmered like liquid starlight in neglected corners of the forum, or within the cool, damp crypts of forgotten temples. His tone remained detached, almost scientific, cataloging its preference for shade and moisture, its seemingly benign, almost beautiful luminescence. But then, a subtle shift in the copperplate's usually steady hand. The observations began to take on a darker hue. Lucius Claudius noted peculiar effects on the environment. Water drawn from sources near significant growths tasted faintly metallic and left a strange residue. Crops and fields irrigated by those same waters showed stunted growth and a peculiar sickly pallor, often failing entirely. Animals, too, displayed anomalies. Rodents found near the glow often seemed lethargic, unresponsive, their movements slow and uncoordinated. Birds avoided areas where the moss was particularly prevalent, their usual chirping replaced by an unnatural silence. Dr. Thorne's breath hitched. This was not the familiar litany of barbarian incursions, economic woes, or political corruption. This was a silent, creeping horror. His eyes raced across the vellum to the entries concerning humans. Initially, Lucius Claudius noted a persistent lassitude among his household staff, then a peculiar indifference to the day's pressing matters among minor officials he encountered. Later, the entries grew more alarming. The senator's debate lacked fire. His words, usually sharp, drifted into vague platitudes. My own thoughts, once clear, now feel as if mired in a heavy fog. A strange contentment, yet devoid of joy, settles upon the populace. It wasn't a disease in the conventional sense, not a fever or a plague that ravaged the body. It was an erosion of spirit, a slow, insidious theft of will. Ambition dulled, civic duty became an unbearable burden, and even personal passions withered. The empire hadn't been conquered by sword or coin. It had slowly, imperceptibly, surrendered its very desire to exist. The sheer, chilling scope of this silent contagion, seeping into the consciousness of millions through the very air they breathed, the water they drank, the spaces they inhabited, began to dawn on Dr. Thorne. He leaned back, the ancient parchment still clutched in his trembling hand, the Scriptoria Antiquia suddenly feeling less like a sanctuary of knowledge and more like a crypt holding a terrible, forgotten truth. The entries, initially, were almost comically mundane, descriptions Dr. Thorne might have dismissed as the ramblings of an overly observant scribe, perhaps even slightly hypochondriac. Dating back to the late 3rd century, the earliest notations spoke of a creeping weariness among Latium's field workers, followed by an unusual lack of zeal in the urban legion's morning exercises. Mention was made of children exhibiting peculiar listlessness after midday meals, and the elderly forgetting simple commands with alarming frequency. Individually, each entry was a ripple, easily overlooked in the vast ocean of Roman life. But as Dr. Thorne's gaze traversed the fragile vellum, following the meticulous Latin script through the decades, the ripples converged, forming an undeniable current. What started as minor inconveniences escalated. By the early 4th century, the notes grew more frequent, the observations sharper. Cassius, the scribe Thorne now realized was a diligent, if bewildered, witness, detailed a noticeable decline in public discourse, rhetoric growing simplistic, logical arguments less cogent. Even Rome's renowned engineers, once innovative, struggled to devise new solutions, often repeating old designs with less efficacy. Magistrates, once decisive, frequently succumbed to indecision or made impulsive judgments, leading to chaotic court proceedings. Cassius's later entries, spanning into the mid-4th century, grew darker, laced with quiet desperation. He began to track not just observations, but spread. The listlessness and forgetfulness were no longer confined to specific groups. They seemed to be affecting entire populations, moving like an invisible tide. He noted families where entire generations seemed afflicted by an inexplicable lassitude, a gradual erosion of the Roman intellect and will. The farmers neglect their fields, the artisans their crafts, the soldiers their drills, one chilling passage read. A great dullness has fallen upon the minds of men, leaving them prone to indolence and quick to anger, yet lacking the fire to channel such emotion into productive acts. Dr. Thorne felt a cold dread seep into his bones, far colder than the scriptoria's ancient chill. This wasn't merely decline, it was an epidemic of the mind, a slow-acting poison dismantling Rome's cognitive and emotional foundations. It wasn't invading hordes, economic collapse, or political infighting. These, Thorne now understood with terrifying clarity, were symptoms, not causes. The real reason, hidden in Cassius's mundane ledgers, was a pervasive biological agent that robbed Romans of their ingenuity, discipline, ambition, and capacity to govern or resist external pressures. He leaned back, the faint scent of decay from the parchment filling his nostrils, suddenly feeling faint. Decades spent dissecting conventional narratives of Rome's fall, arguing for multi-causal explanations, seemed futile now. This was an entirely different beast, a silent, invisible enemy that didn't kill outright but slowly unmade a civilization, leaving a husk ripe for collapse. The final entries, scribbled hastily, were almost illegible, yet one phrase stood out, repeated like a desperate prayer. It began with the water in the wells after the strange green bloom. Dr. Thorne leaned back, rubbing his temples, the scent of aged paper a counterpoint to the revelation unfolding before him. The early entries, detailing vague malaise among Latium's populace, had been easy to dismiss, but his scholarly intuition, honed over decades, urged him onward. He adjusted the lamp, its beam highlighting the scribe's shifting hand. As the dates progressed into the early 4th century, the observations grew less subjective, more troubling, shedding their initial guise of mundane grumbling. Apathy, the scribe noted in one entry, dated to 312 CE. It creeps into the spirit like evening fog, dampening the brightest flame. Even the gladiatorial games, once a roaring blaze, now draw but a languid gaze. The young men lack the old fire. Their drills grow slovenly, their ambition a distant echo, replaced by a preference for idleness. Dr. Thorne's eyes widened, a dawning horror replacing skepticism. Apathy? Not just physical weariness, but a profound decline in civic engagement, martial spirit, and basic human drive? He scanned ahead, his fingers trembling slightly as he turned the fragile, translucent vellum. Later entries became starker, the observations more clinical in their despair. The fields lie fallow, for the hands that once tilled them find only solace in slumber, read an entry from 340 CE. The artisans, once famed for their exquisite crafts, now produce shoddy imitations, their minds seemingly dulled, their fingers clumsy, their innovation evaporated. Further mentions detailed a curious forgetfulness plaguing the elderly, a lack of vigor in the Senate's once heated debates, and the legions, though numerous, moving with a sluggishness and lack of initiative that chills the heart. The scribe had meticulously documented what Dr. Thorne recognized as a slow, systemic collapse of Roman vitality. This wasn't a sudden, acute plague. This was a creeping erosion, a pervasive dimming of the very essence of human drive and capability. It affected muscle, mind, and spirit, subtly undermining the complex foundations of a civilization that relied on energy, ambition, intellectual prowess, and unwavering civic duty. Dr. Thorne felt a chill deeper than the ancient stone walls, a revelation resonating through his very bones. This wasn't just individual malaise. The scribe's notations connected disparate observations across regions and social strata. A noticeable decline in birth rates, noted alongside a pervasive lassitude among women. Increased susceptibility to common illnesses, enough to drain collective strength and manpower. Even Roman infrastructure suffered, with less meticulous repairs and grand new projects dwindling. He saw the pattern now, weaving through the seemingly random notes, coalescing into an escapable truth, an empire slowly losing its intrinsic capacity to act, to create, to defend. Not primarily because of barbarians at the gate, though they were certainly there, opportunistically preying on weakness, but because the Romans themselves were gradually losing the will and the wherewithal to fight them, to govern, to innovate, or even to sustain their own population with their former vigor. The internal rot, as the scribe had documented, was far more insidious and comprehensive than any external threat.
The real reason, Aris realized with a jolt that left him breathless, wasn't a single cataclysmic event, nor a simple confluence of well-trodden factors. It was a slow, agonizing erosion from within, a hidden biological phenomenon that systematically stripped away the very qualities that had built Rome and sustained it. The creeping weariness had metastasized into an empire-wide spiritual and physical enfeeblement, leaving Rome a hollowed-out shell, incapable of responding to challenges both old and new. The final entry, dated just a few years before Rome's traditional fall in 476 CE, was brief and chilling. The light grows dim, not from lack of oil, but from the flame's own exhaustion. Dr. Thorne stared at the words, the ancient ink screaming a truth centuries in the making, a truth so devastatingly simple, so profoundly overlooked. He knew with absolute certainty that he held in his hands not just a forgotten ledger, but the missing, crucial chapter of Rome's decline, a biological narrative explaining why the greatest empire had not truly fallen, but had instead, slowly, imperceptibly, faded away, its people drained of the very lifeblood that once fueled its glory.
Dr. Thorne adjusted his spectacles, his gaze sweeping over the next few pages of the ledger. The entries, he now realized, were charting a silent catastrophe. What began as creeping weariness soon escalated, evolving beyond mere physical fatigue. The meticulous scribe, whose identity remained a mystery, had moved beyond personal observation to systematic, if amateur, sociological documentation. The phrases jumped out at Thorne, stark and chilling against the faded vellum. The fire in their eyes dims, even in the young. A strange contentment descends, even amidst hardship. The zeal for great undertakings, once Rome's very breath, now a mere whisper. The observations detailed a gradual, pervasive loss of ambition. No longer was it just physical lethargy, it was a deeper, existential quietude. The entries recorded a marked decrease in the number of new aqueducts commissioned, fewer grand forums planned, an increasing reluctance to embark on distant campaigns. The legions, one entry from the early 4th century lamented, though still mighty in number, seemed to move with the plodding pace of oxen, their thunderous charge a memory. The will to conquer, once an unquenchable thirst, is sated by the smallest draught. Thorne's heart pounded with a historian's dread and excitement. This wasn't merely social decay or political infighting, those were widely accepted symptoms. This described a foundational shift in the very essence of the Roman spirit. The scribe, with heartbreaking precision, documented the slow erosion of civic pride, the diminishing passion for innovation, even a peculiar blandness in public discourse. He noted instances of brilliant minds lapsing into quiet resignation, of vibrant artists settling for repetition, of fierce debaters losing the spark of argument and accepting consensus with placid indifference. The entries painted a portrait of a people slowly, subtly, losing their drive, their competitive edge, their very Romanitas. Then Thorne found it, a series of entries, underlined twice, scrawled in a more agitated hand, describing a specific, unsettling detail. The grain from the northern reaches, though plentiful and sweet, seems to bear a subtle burden, a faint, almost imperceptible spore upon its husks. Those who partake most frequently, especially among the urban poor and the standing armies, are often the first to exhibit the quiet sickness, a profound apathy, a gradual dimming of the keen intellect. Another entry followed. The physicians dismiss it as melancholy or the vapors, but I have seen it spread through families, not like a fever, but like a shadow passing over the soul, leaving them content to merely be, rather than to strive. The pieces slammed together in Thorne's mind with sickening clarity. Not a plague that ravaged bodies, but a parasitic agent, perhaps a microscopic fungus or a slow-acting toxin, carried subtly through the very food chain that sustained the vast empire. It wasn't designed to kill quickly, but to erode the will, to dampen the intellect, to extinguish the fierce, driving ambition that had forged Rome from a village into a world power. It explained the inexplainable, the slow, agonizing surrender of an empire that, on paper, should have been invincible. Dr. Aris Thorne leaned back, the brittle parchment a testament not to a grand collapse, but to an insidious, unglamorous fade. The true enemy hadn't been barbarians or economic crises alone. It had been something far smaller, far more patient, and utterly devastating. A creeping biological surrender, a silent erosion of the human spirit. The Roman Empire hadn't fallen with a bang or a whimper. It had simply forgotten how to care. And the world had never thought to look for the reason amongst the mundane, in the very grains that fed its populace.